Hello, and welcome to Day by Day True Crime Stories, the podcast where we explore a different crime or justice milestone from this day in history. I'm your host, Kona Gallagher, and today is September 23rd. On this day in 1993, in a section of farm country straddling Illinois and Indiana, a routine afternoon tilted into a nightmare that would hang over two small towns for years. 15-year-old Jessica Lynn, Jessie Roach, was riding her bike one moment, and then the next, she was gone. Weeks later, her body was found in an Indiana cornfield. A suspect emerged, and they were able to get a conviction. Yet still, so much about what happened to Jessie has never fully been answered. Today, we're talking about the abduction and murder of Jessie Roach. What we know, how investigators closed in, and what remains unsettled. Let's get started. Georgetown, Illinois sits only a few miles from the Indiana state line. In 1993, it was the kind of place where the school secretary knew your middle name and the cashier at the corner store asked about your homework. Jessie was 15, a student, a daughter, and a little sister. She loved riding her bike, and she loved the freedom that it gave her. On the day she vanished, she didn't set out for anything bigger than a short ride close to home. Witnesses would later place her pedaling along a familiar route in the mid-afternoon, just casual and unhurried. Nothing about her day suggested danger. And maybe that's what makes what happened next so chilling. The ordinariness of the moment before. When Jessie didn't come home that evening, everyone sprang into action. Friends called friends, and her parents called the police. By evening, a bus driver named Daryl Morgan reported seeing a bicycle lying in the road along one of Jessie's usual paths. Searches began almost immediately. Family, neighbors, and volunteers checked ditches and fence lines, wooded edges, and creek beds. Deputies drove gravel roads slowly, scanning culverts and tree lines. Days became weeks, but the leads were few and far between. Then, nearly 7 weeks after she vanished, on November 8, 1993, a farmer working ground near Perrysville, Indiana, made a grim discovery. Human remains in a cornfield. It was Jessica. Because of the amount of time that had passed, decomposition limited what the coroner could determine. The precise time of death was uncertain. The exact place of death was unknown. Forensic findings could not pin down every detail of how Jessie was killed. But what investigators did have were two things that they could act on: the known timeline of her disappearance, and, in the months that followed, reports from other teenage girls in and around Georgetown. Several teenagers told the police that they had been followed by a man in a van while they had been walking or biking. The incidents were unsettlingly similar in both tone and timing. Fortunately, one girl had been able to get a partial license plate number off the van. Police were able to trace the plate to a van registered to Larry Dwayne Hall, a young man living across the line in Indiana. Hall's van matched the descriptions, and he lived close enough to know the area. He had time and opportunity. And when investigators interviewed him in October 1994, he made statements that piqued their interest. Later, he even made a signed confession in which he admitted to abducting and killing Jessie. But even with all of that, closure was not going to come easily. Hall later recanted his confession, and the defense challenged the reliability of it in the first place. Without a confirmed murder scene, the prosecution had a harder road to prove exactly where and how Jessie died beyond a reasonable doubt. So, investigators documented what they could. They searched Hall's van and property, they connected the partial license plate, and they gathered accounts from the girls who had been followed. And they were able to build a federal case that didn't require an exact murder location: kidnapping for sexual purposes and transporting a victim across state lines. Hall was arrested in December 1994 at his parents' home in Wabash County, Indiana. In June 1995, he was convicted in federal court of kidnapping Jessica Roach for sexual gratification and transporting her across state lines. He wasn't convicted for her murder. The trial focused on what could be proven: Jessie's disappearance in Illinois, her remains that were found in Indiana, Hall's own words, the pattern of behavior with other girls, and physical evidence that was consistent with the abduction. The government didn't have to prove the exact method of killing to secure the kidnapping conviction, and because investigators could not establish the murder scene or all the forensic details with certainty, a homicide charge just wasn't brought. Over the years, law enforcement has examined whether Hall could be linked to other disappearances and killings across the Midwest. Some investigators believe that he may have had many victims, some say up to 30 or 40. However, most of those suspected cases remain uncharged, unproven, or unresolved. In the months after Jessie's disappearance, kids in Georgetown changed their routes to school. Parents drove instead of letting their teens walk. The fear was real, and the lesson was cruel. Jessica Roach's case is in some ways a blueprint for the hardest missing persons investigations. A rural terrain, a body found weeks later, an uncertain crime scene, and then a confession that was given and then recanted. It shows how the law sometimes arrives only partway. How guilty can be proven for one charge while justice feels unfinished for the family who has to live with the results. While Jessie's family was able to receive partial justice, there are many more women and girls whose murders law enforcement believe were at the hands of Hall, but whose cases can't be proven. Though Larry Hall wasn't convicted of Jessie's murder, police were at least able to put a stop to the harm that he had spread across the country. He is now serving life in prison without the possibility of parole in Federal Correctional Complex in North Carolina. Thank you for listening to today's episode of Day by Day True Crime Stories. If you found Jessie's story compelling, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. It'll help us grow. And be sure to join me again tomorrow as we explore another significant event in true crime history. Until then, stay safe, and remember that behind every headline is a life worth remembering. Day by Day, True Crime Stories is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you can do it!